Modern Western culture contains a core belief that I think a lot of people take for granted. The idea that technology, society, morality, and all aspects of human life are progressing. That things are improving, moving forward along a natural course. That things are evolving towards a more true or better version of themselves. This vision of the world sees the past as inferior, an older, worse version of the present, while the future is supreme, radical, transcendent, and most importantly, just out of reach. This is a continuation of my previous essay on emergent narratives in Europa Universalis IV. Last time I talked about narratives of power, violence, and government. If you want to hear the introduction to EU4 and the concept of emergent narratives in video games, I suggest watching the first video, but this one is written to be pretty much independent, so you don't need to. I also want to thank everyone for watching the last video, and especially for all the encouraging feedback I received. I really hope these videos can be a place for discussion about the topics I'm analyzing, so whether you agree or disagree, I'd love to continue hearing everyone's thoughts. In the first section, I mentioned how people might shrug at the violent atrocities represented in EU4 by saying, that's just how people were back then. This kind of thinking is super common, and while it literally is true that people used to commit atrocities, this kind of thinking implies that today we know better. By doing this, we position our present cultures as morally superior to past cultures. If you live on Earth, you also know that some people, if not most people, see their culture, morality, or lifestyle as morally superior to others, and often frame this superiority as more modern or civilized. This way of framing a relationship to an other positions the other not just as inferior, but also as past. Phrases like living in the past or backward highlight this kind of perceived relationship. If we view societies in this kind of progress-focused lens, where progress means things we agree with and everything else is backward, you could pretty much argue anything and say it's in favor of progress. I saw this in the responses to the first part of the video. Some people argued that European societal systems are adopted across the world simply because they are good. Others suggested something I often hear from defenders of European supremacy, which is that military domination is natural and that Europe just happened to develop its military technology sooner than other places, which justifies its dominion. Might makes right is an expression that comes to mind. This is kind of a tangent, but why do we so often conflate military power with societal or moral superiority? It really is insane if you stop and think about it. Is a society morally superior when it gets better at killing other people? I mean, I just really don't understand that argument. The idea of progress is inherently intertwined with the strategy video game genre. In the previous section, I used chess as an example for how narratives of power, violence, and government can emerge from gameplay systems. But for progress narratives, I'm not sure we can really find any in chess. I think this is for two reasons. First, chess has no in-game sense of time outside of the turns themselves. The passage of time in chess is marked only by the player's movements, not any external changes in the game systems. If this doesn't entirely make sense, don't worry, I'll talk more about what I mean by this later. Second is that Western chess is, at the very least, over 1,000 years old, with its early origins even older, and the modern game more or less established by the late Middle Ages. This means that chess was created in a time and place when progress was literally not a dominant way of seeing the passage of time. The dominant narrative of time in the Middle Ages was that things don't change, that things are constant in their natural form, and that these deviations from natural form eventually result in a correction back to natural form. This applied to societal norms like the peasant-aristocrat feudal relationships, but also to ideas of social progress, technological progress, and moral progress. Basically, there was no such thing as natural progress the way we might imagine it today. And instead of the idea of progress being natural, it was things staying the same that was natural. Imagine for a second how great it would be in some ways to not live in a world dominated by ideas of progress. I'm not saying I would want to live in the Middle Ages, not at all, but it sounds nice to imagine living without the constant pressure of individual or global progress, and without the constant knowledge that almost everything about society is radically transforming by the minute. So EU4 isn't chess, and it was created in a time and place deeply steeped with the ideas of progress. This isn't about a right or wrong way to tell history. It's just about recognizing how we tell history using the lens of our own beliefs. And progress is a belief, it's a point of view, it's an opinion or a model to make sense of events. EU4 incorporates ideas of progress into its core game mechanics to try to illustrate how much changed in the world from 1444 to 1821. This time period was absolutely one of the most transformational in human history, with the origin of today's dominant global ideas like capitalism, industrialization, democracy, and globalization. From a purely mechanical perspective, the game also uses narratives of historical progress as a gameplay incentive to give players that feeling of player progression and accomplishment. In my introduction to EU4, I mentioned that time is a resource to be spent, but there's also a feeling of satisfaction that comes from watching time pass. This feeling of growth, of progress, is baked into EU4's many mechanical spheres, including the military, internal administration, and economics, which is why I want to talk about progress at this point. Players are constantly experiencing not just the growth in their power, in their income, or in their territory, but they're also experiencing growth in the available strategies through the options that become available as progress gates are opened throughout the game. These gates to progress are diverse. First are national ideas and idea groups, which give players customization over their playstyle and a varied tool set to approach the game's varied challenges. Next are technologies, which affect almost everything in the game and give a linear set of bonuses based on the country's technology group. More on that later. Then you have the institution system, which limits the adoption of technologies for countries who have not spent the resources to adopt the new institutions. Finally, the game's ages serve to define the primary narrative concern of nations by slightly changing certain mechanics and game systems to conform to the prevalent system of the time period. Each player by the end of the game should acquire 64 ideas, including ambitions, 32 technologies, 8 institutions, and will play through 4 ages. It's nice when the math is mathing. I looked for something that had the number 16, but I couldn't find it. Ideas represent the specific systems, governments, cultural effects, or policies of a given country. Basically, ideas represent the dominant ideas in a given country and affect what the country is specialized in or prioritizing. For example, the exploration idea group grants the ability to explore deep ocean and unknown territory, as well as granting colonists for eventual colonization of the lands in the Americas, Africa, and certain parts of Asia. The defensive idea group represents a style of warfare that focuses on strong forts, supply lines, high attrition for invading armies, and also gives some extra bonuses to your army's maneuverability and morale. Every idea group has a general theme centered on one aspect of EU4's mechanics. Idea groups have a massive impact in terms of these non-military mechanical domains, but their impact tends to diminish throughout the game as bonuses pile on and each one becomes progressively less meaningful. Specializing at the right time has a huge impact on a country's ability to succeed in a given domain. For example, taking administrative ideas before conquering a lot of territory will make a huge difference in the effectiveness of maintaining those territories after they are acquired. What this means for progress narratives is that ideas affect the player's personal emergent narrative of growth in a specialized way. A player takes the admin idea group hoping to then conquer better, or takes offensive ideas to fight wars better, and then proceeds to focus on this aspect to maximize the benefits of the ideas they chose. This allows players to narratively layer what their country is good at within their internal story of what's happening. For example, players who choose a Dutch country in 1444 seeking to form the Netherlands might take trade ideas to represent the Dutch trading empire, or economic ideas to represent the historically strong Dutch banks. These choices have a kind of roleplay-esque quality to them, but are not exactly roleplay, as they can also be considered a strategic playstyle choice given the same conditions of the Netherlands historically. It's more that players use the opportunity of mechanical specialization to explore different ways of playing the game within a narrativized framework as presented by the thematic nature of the idea groups. Basically, it wouldn't feel as good narratively to select a bunch of disconnected trade bonuses throughout the game as it does to choose an idea group where the player can narratively tell themselves that their country will now be good at and focus on trade. Sometimes ideas are less about making a country good at a specific domain and more about compensating for a weakness or taking advantage of a specific geographic or government situation that allows the existing situation to be complemented by the chosen ideas. An example of this sort of adaptation would be the Central Asian hordes choosing aristocratic ideas to maximize the benefits of their highly lethal, cavalry-focused military. I think this form of mechanical and narrative progression should be considered asynchronous because while it's still a form of progression, players can select any idea group at any point when they unlock a new slot. There's no form of linear progression and no sense of being behind per se, except for within the goals of the player themselves. This is an adaptable, asynchronous form of progression generally based on narrative and mechanical choices made by the player, rather than choices made by the developers. I say generally because, of course, there are elements of linear gatekeeping designed into this system. Idea group slots are only unlocked at very specific admin technology levels, so the kind of mechanically specialized asynchronous progression of countries is in turn gated by a more linear and global level of in-game progression. Before I get into the narrative inner workings of technology, I want to talk a little bit about the costs associated with acquiring ideas and technologies, as that's important to understand before diving into any analysis of the technological narratives in EU4. Idea groups are subdivided into three main categories: administrative, diplomatic, and military, and each idea costs a base of 400 of their respective monarch power to acquire, which makes ideas the second biggest investment of monarch points in the game, at least in terms of buying bonuses and modifiers for progression. The costs of ideas and technologies can also be modified through bonuses, so the costs for a specific country depend a lot on that country. It also brings up one of the most satisfying aspects of EU4 gameplay progression, which is stacking bonuses to reach really cheap costs or really huge bonuses for important gameplay systems. Stacking idea cost reduction bonuses until your ideas only cost a fraction of their base price makes a huge difference over the course of the game, since these costs only add up over the decades. Technologies have a base cost of 600, adding up to a total of 18,000 of each monarch point to unlock the 30 technologies by the end of the game. This means that the total base cost for any given category of technology costs slightly less than the total of unlocking all the ideas combined, so keep that in mind if you're ever deciding between tech cost reduction and idea cost reduction. The cost for technologies and ideas, unlike other games, does not increase over time at all, but only changes through modifiers that can be acquired or lost by the player. This makes technologies a consistently massive and necessary investment for players and something they'll always need to be keeping up with. Just like ideas, technologies are unlocked in a linear design. Technologies have a specific year where they're meant to be taken, and taking a tech before that year requires paying a very expensive penalty that scales according to how ahead of time in tech you are. This makes it impossible to rush ahead in tech and prevents players from sprinting centuries ahead, unlike in other games like Civilization. Another thing to consider about the total cost of technologies is institutions, which I'll talk about in a bit. Unlike ideas, technologies are a global measurement of progress. First of all, the world is divided into a number of technology groups, all of which have access to similar technologies. Tech groups are a bit silly to me because they explicitly essentialize large groups of people into civilizational or cultural categories that often don't really make sense. Like, are you really telling me that the technology in Estonia is identical to the technology in Portugal, but that just across the border in the Emirate of Granada, suddenly it's a completely different technological sphere? Or in the same vein, that Granada is somehow more similar to Afghanistan's technology than to the neighboring Spanish kingdoms? It's nonsense, and it seems to be divided in a very presentist mindset, with Europe divided into an Eastern and Western bloc, as well as Muslims being their own thing and all being the same thing. Bit silly to me. Technology groups affect the details of the specific bonuses that countries receive for acquiring a certain level of technology. For example, the Chinese tech group nations have military units at tech level 5 that are slightly weaker than the African tech group's equivalent units at the same technology level. This difference can be small in the grand scheme of things, as army quality is determined not just by the number of pips a given unit has due to technology, but also tactics, morale, discipline, combat width, and a lot of other factors. Still, technology groups serve as a way to spice up combat and diversify the strengths and weaknesses of any given country, while still making the weaknesses surmountable for players who know how to improve the other variables that affect army quality. The biggest difference in power across all domains of the game doesn't really come from technology groups per se, but rather the level of technology that a given country has. Brand new players starting in Western Europe who don't know the importance of keeping up to date in technology often find themselves losing every battle within a couple decades, because falling behind in technology can be a death sentence for any nation, regardless of its location in the world. It's worth noting that what is considered behind in technology is partly determined by local factors and partly by global ones. The local factor is that if your neighbor has a much higher technology level than you, you're going to have a hard time fighting any kind of war against them. However, if you and your neighbor are both behind in technology at a global scale, but equally so, it won't matter as much for your regional influence. This is how EU4 handles the idea of regional technological differences and the kind of relative strength certain militaries had in certain regions of the world historically. It's the temporal factor of technologies that makes them more challenging to manage. Idea group investment can be temporarily neglected if a country isn't producing enough monarch points, but if technology is neglected, a country can quickly fall apart during warfare. I know I've criticized this game a lot so far, and I will continue to do so, but I think from a gameplay perspective, the ideas and technology system is really excellent game design. Ideas allow a vast replayability within a narrow framework that isn't too hard to learn, and technologies allow a sense of constant urgency and an arms race with neighbors that is really satisfying when you learn to use it effectively. I honestly have never noticed a major difference in my own tech group's fighting ability across a few thousand hours of gameplay. And though there are differences, it's not something that I consider when I'm going into a difficult war. I do consider technology, ideas, and other quality bonuses. Those are the most important factors. There's a couple noteworthy exceptions to the tech groups don't matter line of thinking, but I'll get to those when I talk about institutions. Despite the sense that tech groups alone are not too defining in terms of your technological destiny, there is a sense in EU4 that advanced technology means European technology. Because I'm not an expert on this topic and it really is something that's actively in contention in historical discourse today, I'm going to reference this really interesting YouTube channel that popped up in my suggested a few months ago. I'm just going to play the introduction to one of his videos and I think you'll see where I'm going with this.
Africans south of the Sahara did not use the wheel, and in this video I want to explore why that might have been. First of all, I want to address right away a couple of guesses that some people might make. Some people might guess that Africans did not adopt the wheel because they lacked innovation or, technological creativity. But we know from historical and archaeological evidence that that's not true because they had other technologies. They had textile production, they worked with iron. When Europeans arrived in Africa, the African rulers were quite eager to acquire their firearms and even produce firearms locally. So we can rule that out right now. I mean, they were perfectly fine creating and adopting technologies. Another guess that someone might make would be that, people of sub-Saharan Africa were cut off from the rest of the world and therefore did not have the opportunity to borrow technologies from Europe and Asia. But we also know that that's not true because large parts of Africa were, in fact, connected with the rest of the world through trade networks. In West Africa, they were connected to the Mediterranean through this trans-Saharan trade network. And in East Africa and parts of Southern Africa, they were tied into the Indian Ocean trade network. And in fact, some African merchants did visit India and Southeast Asia in the Middle Ages and would have had the opportunity to see wheeled carts firsthand. And yet they never used that technology in Africa. So the question remains, why didn't they have the wheel? In order to answer that question, I want to start by raising another question, which is, why would we expect Africans to use the wheel?
Premodernist goes on to make the point that while wheels were used in Europe and East and Southeast Asia, the wheel was not the primary mode of transportation. Instead, it was navigable waterways that were the preferred method to transport goods. He goes on to say how in places like North Africa, the Middle East, and Central Asia, camels actually displaced the existing wheeled transportation to such an extent that many areas had completely abandoned wheels in favor of camels. In these societies, the camel was a clearly superior technology to wheels for many reasons, but basically because they were cheaper and easier to maintain as a transportation infrastructure. The point I want to emphasize from this pre-modernist video is to dispel the frankly commonplace narrative that pre-colonial African societies were somehow isolated from the rest of the world, that they were behind in terms of technological advancement due to either a lack of innovation or a lack of willingness to adopt foreign technologies. Premodernist uses the common example of the wheel not being adopted by African countries to demonstrate how the idea of universal linear technological advancement is not only inaccurate but also harmful. Wheels were adopted in places where it made sense to adopt them. Sometimes wheels were not adopted at all, and other times they were replaced by other technologies when those technologies were a better fit for the people and the places they served. So the point he's making is that all humans will innovate and adopt technologies when they are useful to them. Sub-Saharan Africans didn't adopt wheels because carts and the animals needed to pull those carts weren't adapted to the environmental conditions in Sub-Saharan Africa. And if you want to hear more about why, I suggest that video next. It's great. Premodernist cites all his sources in the video description, so you can check those out as well. I'm going to save my juice on the strategy game series Civilization for another video, but I just want to give a quick example of just how widespread the notion of wheels being a primordial technology is in modern Western society. In Civilization 6, the wheel is a technology players unlock in the ancient era at the same time as bronze working. If we consider bronze working to represent the historical Bronze Age within the game, we can date the wheel's diegetic in-game time as roughly between 3300 to 1200 BCE, or about 3,000 to 5,000 years before EU4 start date in 1444. So of course, when players are constantly fed the notion that the wheel is a primordial technology, and then they hear that Africans or West Asians hadn't adopted the wheel when the colonial European powers arrived, the natural conclusion is that European powers were thousands of years ahead in terms of technology. And we'll get into this later, but the idea that Europeans were technologically advanced goes on to feed other narratives about European progress that have more wide-reaching and sinister consequences than just technology. Check out this quote Premodernist put in his video description. The conventional notion that Africans failed to employ the wheel because of lack of initiative or intelligence is intellectually unsatisfactory, not so much because it is racist as because it is circular. Africans are supposed to have ignored the wheel because they were unenterprising, and the evidence that they were unenterprising is that they failed to adopt the wheel. From the point of view of a North African, you could give Europe the same treatment and act like they are just technologically way behind with their silly little wheels and boats when camels were the obviously superior technology. I mean, everywhere around me people use camels, so why wouldn't Europeans understand how much better camels are? They must just be inferior in some way. You see how ridiculous that sounds? And I'm not trying to say that some technologies aren't huge advantages over others. Like, clearly agriculture has been pretty huge for providing food to lots and lots of people, and is the single biggest reason why the human population has exploded in the last few millennia. Technologies do at times give societies major advantages over how they used to live or how their neighbors live. The part I take issue with is the false assumptions and justifications for narratives of superiority, domination, or exploitation based on those technological advantages. I don't think that people who have technological advantages deserve to use those technologies to exploit or otherwise dominate other people, and I'm not really sure why that's an unpopular opinion. People will argue that it's natural, but I don't really care, as I discussed in the last part. Murder is natural if you want to take it there. My position is a moral one. I'm not arguing against the fact that exploitation exists, obviously. I'm arguing for a more egalitarian view of humanity. Back to EU4. Now that we've established a foundational perspective on the common narratives of technological progress in EU4's time period, we can see how technological advancement in EU4 pushes a narrative of linear progress with consistent developments of advantageous adaptations that improve many aspects of society. And these improvements are in line with the represented game mechanics: warfare, administration, diplomacy, and economy. Technology allows players to unlock new buildings for their provinces that increase values such as taxation or naval force limit. These buildings themselves are usually ahistorical and only placed in the game's progression for the sake of gameplay itself. An example of this is the fact that in Europe in 1444, churches are not available to be purchased until nations unlock the first admin tech for temples, while cathedrals aren't available till Tech 19, which is unlocked on time in 1648. Obviously, churches and cathedrals were built all over Europe before 1648, so that limitation is just to create a sense of progression, as churches and cathedrals provide a taxation bonus in the province they are built in. I'll dive more in depth into these economic mechanics in the dedicated section later on. The idea here is to show how technologies unlock new mechanics for players to generate an additional sense of progression, whether military, economic, diplomatic, etc. I also want to point out before moving on from technologies that the game has a diegetic text element describing the role of the technology and giving a little bit of context into why it exists. These diegetic story elements of EU4 are easily skipped over by players like me who tend to only read the bonuses and the malices, but do create an atmosphere for players more interested in the narrative events of the game. If we take a look at these descriptions, we see that administrative text 0 through 2 take us narratively through a condensed version of what EU4 considers the trajectory of human political organization. Tech 0 is a tribal government, which is called the most basic unit of governance, while Tech 1 is advanced tribes and Tech 2 is feudal monarchy. Tech 3 is where most tech groups in the world start in 1444, including Europe, Anatolia, the Muslims, India, and the Chinese tech groups, and is called medieval administration. Just like with handing out bonuses, EU4 takes certain liberties here with how it presents narratives of progress when it comes to technological advancement, or more specifically in this case, social political organization. EU4 is not really suggesting that all the world governments were tribal governments in 1350, but instead uses these initial states as baselines for the tech cost calculations, which depend heavily on the in-game year. Despite not suggesting that the early techs are realistic, the game firmly places certain tech groups chronologically and evolutionarily behind other tech groups. There really is no reason for this except as a narrative choice on the part of EU4's creators to favor a progress-oriented historical perspective. If you think I'm being unrealistic, as people did in the feedback from the first video, I want you to consider how technologies actually do benefit certain societies. In what context can we create comparative analysis of technological advantage? The first instance that comes to mind for me is war. We can say automatic assault rifles are better weapons than a bow and arrow because they can do more harm. Of course, producing and upkeeping assault rifles requires an entire military-industrial system in the background, which we rarely think about. A lot of science fiction deals with the idea that certain technological advancements are not worth the costs they incur on the societies that adopt them. But I wonder why in popular discourse we never tend to question our current technologies in the same way. Another way in which we can compare two technological systems from two countries is adaptation to their environment. For example, we can say that clothing, an important facet of human technology, developed by the Inuit, is particularly well adapted to the harsh weather environment of Inuit societies. We can say that ancient Egyptian irrigation systems were impressive adaptations to the frequent flooding of the Nile and allowed much more food to be produced and other infrastructure to be protected from flooding. We can say that the domestication of horses allowed various steppe peoples over the millennia to essentially dominate every single other group they came into contact with through overwhelming military superiority. But how can we compare Egyptian irrigation under, say, Ramses the Great to Mongol military technology of Chinggis Khan? Does that comparison really make any sense? EU4 tries to partly solve this problem of technological comparison by subdividing technology into the usual three domains: administration, diplomacy, and military. But within those domains, technology remains strictly linear with relationships of superiority and inferiority, as well as the narratives of a temporal past as inferior, and most interestingly and most harmfully, a kind of universalist view of all human development. Of course, the gold standard for technology is the Western tech group, as evidenced by their eventual military pip superiority in the late game. Look, it's one thing to point out how European technologies allowed European states to dominate much of the world in recent centuries, but it's another thing to ascribe superiority to those technologies simply because of that fact. The first part is a fact. The second part is a narrative, one that has had significant social, political, and economic benefits for the West to maintain and propagate. Think about it. If you go around bullying the whole world and convince everyone that they're actually better off, and that your bullying was because you were more advanced, you can both justify your bullying and, this is the most important part, you can maintain your position as superior to the world you're seeking to control. Modern Europe is not the only society to do this, not at all, but since we're talking about EU4, a game set so close to our current time, it's something that's much more relevant to the present. These ideas have never gone away, as evidenced by the comments defending European superiority that I get on my videos. I'm sure I'll see them on this video as well. I'm a little bit surprised by how EU4 adopts these narratives of linear technological progress, of set technological and societal trajectories, despite being, as mentioned, a game where player freedom and ingenuity, as well as the ability to change history, is at the core of players' gameplay motivation. It's like the game is constantly torn whether it wants to be a historical role-playing game or a historical simulator. Back in 2017, institutions were added to create more dynamic complexity in the overly linear technological systems we just discussed. According to the wiki, institutions are described as fundamental advances in civilization and are the primary determinant of technology cost. Technologies require specific institutions to be embraced and will have increased tech cost penalties otherwise. I'll come back to the fundamental advances in civilization in a bit. First, let's explain institutions. Institutions appear in a specific province every 50 years starting in 1450, with the criteria for the starting province depending on the institution's criteria. For example, the first new institution that spawns is Renaissance, which only spawns in mainland Italy. After an institution spawns in the world, all countries start to receive penalties when trying to acquire the new technologies if they don't have that institution. Institutions spread to nearby provinces based on a number of factors, which can be promoted by certain ideas and other bonuses. Once an institution has spread to enough provinces to represent more than 10% of the autonomy modified development of a country, which is the total development multiplied by the average autonomy of the country, that country is able to spend money to embrace the institution. Once embraced, institutions remove all penalties for technologies they were holding back and usually provide a small bonus as well. For example, embracing Renaissance provides a bonus of -5% to development and construction costs. Basically, institutions represent the social, political, and cultural enablers for the development or adoption of new technologies. They're institutions in the large sense, like the institution of feudalism, not institutions in the small sense like a specific university institution. Actually, universities are a great example. One of the later institutions is Enlightenment and propagates in provinces where a university has been built. Institutions also demarcate the wider trends in historical periods over the course of the game. For a somewhat old but extremely high quality, in-depth look at institutions, I recommend taking a look at the Riemann's Paradox video, which I'll link in the description. Riemann goes into much more depth on the quantitative analysis side that I will be doing here. Although it'd be really cool to examine the quantitative side of things to determine the narratives that emerge from those numbers, it would also take a much longer video than the current scope allows. From a more mechanical narrative perspective, institutions represent the spread of ideas across the world that in turn affect the adoption of new technologies. The game has 8 institutions in total: feudalism, Renaissance, colonialism, printing press, global trade, manufactories, enlightenment, and industrialization. If we take a look at the types of historical phenomena that each of these institutions refers to, we can organize these into different categories. I identified them as 3 political economic systems, 2 cultural, artistic, scientific movements, and 3 technological developments that had accompanying social and political changes. What's cool about these categories is how they show the interconnectedness of all aspects of societal activity. It's really hard to say if industrialization should be seen more as a technological or economic phenomenon, but in my opinion, it's primarily a technological change with an accompanying economic change. Similarly, it's difficult to disentangle these institutions from each other. Colonialism and global trade seem particularly linked, as does Enlightenment and industrialization. I think Paradox did a good job selecting European historical movements that feel large and all-encompassing across a variety of societal domains. And yes, while some of these ideas are vague enough to have analogs outside of Europe, like feudalism, the way institutions are framed narratively is extremely specific to the narrative of Western historical progress. If you feel like that's not true, that these institutions really are as universal as they seem in the game, consider how a Japanese historical lens might change this list of institutions. Which ones would still be on the list? I'm not an expert, but you can bet Renaissance would not be there, nor would colonialism, nor global trade, at least not in the same year as EU4's version of events. That's not to say that such a framing would omit historical facts. There might be some mechanic of Europeans expanding to other continents, and certainly a sense of having to manage relationships with Europeans who arrive in Japan to trade, as this was a major source of social and political contention in Japanese history. Just as it seems really silly to say that England entered the Edo period in the 17th century, it's silly and frankly not true to say that Japanese lands somehow adopted the Renaissance in the 16th century. And yet, that's the narrative that the game is putting forward. Despite suggesting the universality of the relevance of the game's institutions, some tech groups start out definitively penalized in their institutional advancement. The Andeans, North, South, and Mesoamericans, Aboriginals, West and Central Africans, Polynesians, and nomadic tech groups take a penalty to their institutions. If we take the wiki's word for it, I guess these cultures are simply less advanced civilizationally. Or maybe these societies are just the least similar to European societies during this period. Looking forward to the comments on that one. Additionally, even if we acknowledge that the institutions themselves can spawn outside of Europe, theoretically making Europe simply a backwater of, say, India, that's not the whole story. As mentioned, the narrative conceptualization of the institutions makes most of them seem very strange spawning somewhere outside of Europe. The need for narrative coherence is why the Renaissance, for example, must spawn in Italy. If the Renaissance could spawn in China, it simply wouldn't be the Renaissance. In recognizing this fact, the EU4 team has solved half of the problem. It admits the uniqueness of the technological and social factors that create historical changes with repercussions throughout society. Despite admitting this uniqueness, EU4 chooses to only select the unique state of the European historical trajectory as worthy of representation, and applies this lens to the entire simulated world, leading to a strange discontinuity in some aspects of gameplay. For example, it used to be a really good idea for players in East Asia to take colonial ideas as the first idea group, in order to spawn colonialism and delay technological advancement in Europe. I've used this strategy myself. But consider what this means for the emergent narrative of the player's nation. It means that the East Asian country they are playing as must adopt a European playstyle in terms of the historical narratives in order to spawn the obviously European institution of settler colonialism in East Asia. I talked about this phenomenon in the first part as well. The idea that basically the optimal way to play outside of Europe is almost always to act like a European state, or to somehow piggyback off of European institutions or government structures. To me, these choices make clear that Paradox is explicitly and intentionally prioritizing Eurocentric narratives when it comes to their narrative and mechanical design, which is consistent with everything else we've seen so far. The largest scale in the sense of progression in EU4 is probably ages. There are just 4 ages that span the entirety of EU4's runtime, with each age lasting about 90 years. Like institutions, ages are narratively centered around specific European historical periods and themes. The 4 ages are the Age of Discovery, which centers on European exploration of the New World, the Age of Reformation, which centers on the Protestant Reformation in Europe, the Age of Absolutism, which centers on the political policies of absolutist monarchies in Europe, and the Age of Revolutions, which centers on the revolutions that swept Europe and her colonies in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. As you can tell, ages drop any pretense of universality and focus entirely on the major themes of European political activity in their given periods. The way ages actually work mechanically is that they provide a series of mini quests to achieve, and for each of these objectives you achieve, countries receive 1 point of splendor per month. With that splendor, countries can redeem bonuses that last until the current age ends. Unlike the explicit narrative aspects of ages, the mechanics of objectives and rewards are much more balanced across the countries in the game, especially if players prepare in advance. For example, while the Asian trade objective in the Age of Reformation might narratively be oriented towards European countries that have begun to take over parts of Asia, the objective is more easily attainable for an actual Asian country. While many objectives can be achieved anywhere in the world, there is only one objective that is specifically intended for non-European countries, which is the objective to be the Emperor of China with 50 mandate during the Age of Absolutism. In addition to this system, each age has some unique and generally overpowered bonuses available to certain countries. I guess this is intended to represent how these countries were particularly noteworthy during the period the age is meant to represent. There are 16 of these unique bonuses across the ages, with 3 of them, 4 if you count the Ottomans, being intended for non-European countries, all of which are in Asia. So yeah, I don't really have much to say about the ages themselves. They don't do a ton for the game aside from spicing things up now and then and giving strong bonuses to already overpowered countries. In some specific scenarios, they can be very useful. The mechanic as a whole is something more to break up the monotony of the years and give a sense of temporal progression, rather than a sense of progression at the scale of your country. Institutions and ages adopt many of the same narratives as technologies and ideas, and from this set of mechanics, we can establish a sense of how EU4 presents all narratives of progress. Like technologies, institutions and ages follow a set path predicated on a specific historical time frame, and that path follows the course of narratives established in European historiography. A common trend across all these mechanics is the way in which EU4's European outlook defines advancement as conformity to European ideas, and then looking at the rest of the world and determining that is behind the times for simply not being European enough. I'm going to say something that sounds like hyperbole, but it isn't, and I'll explain. Political narratives that prioritize progress at all costs are the gateway to brutal authoritarian regimes like fascism. Fascism has many characteristics, but one particular characteristic is that it contains an idea of societal, military, moral, and technological progress taken to an extreme. It states that everything can be improved and everything evolves. If everything evolves, surely there's a superior version of any given thing. Superior humans, superior genes, superior technology, superior government, superior ideology, and society. Okay, but what does this have to do with EU4? Fascism is outside the scope of EU4's time period, right? Well, not necessarily. I want to read a short quote by Aimé Césaire, who is talking about the relationship between European colonialism and Hitler's ideology. That it is Nazism, yes, but that before the Europeans were its victims, they were its accomplices. That they tolerated Nazism before it was inflicted on them. That they absolved it, shut their eyes to it, legitimized it, because until then it had only been applied to non-European peoples. That they have cultivated that Nazism, that they are responsible for it, and that before engulfing the whole of Western Christian civilization in its reddened waters, it oozes, seeps, and trickles from every crack. Toward the end of the time period covered by the game, Western colonialism came to be presented as a natural, progress-bringing mission to backward peoples and territories. Progress in this time period wasn't the way many of us think of progress today, as a kind of focused effort to improve things around us, maybe with an eye on global collaboration. Progress in Europe in the early modern period was largely about spreading European ideas to places considered backward, and so progressing those places into modernity. Those missions to spread progress were the narrative lens through which European powers could justify the colonization of territories, the exploitation of natural resources, enslavement of people, and the subjugation of entire societies. You may have read or heard of the 1899 novella Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. In it, Conrad depicts the horrors of Belgian colonization in the Congo. If you haven't read it, you may have watched the movie Apocalypse Now, which is narratively based on Heart of Darkness, but set in the Vietnam War instead of the Congolese colonial era. And if you don't know any of these, you certainly know Avatar, the 2009 blockbuster that is more or less the exact same story. Heart of Darkness undoubtedly adopts a racist perspective. It indiscriminately disparages and dehumanizes its African characters, using the typical language of African colonization and Western racism against Africans. At the same time, the novella brilliantly depicts the dehumanization of colonization from the point of view of the colonizer. The book dehumanizes its white characters not on the racial basis, but on the basis of their engagement in such horrific acts of brutality and violence as are characteristic of colonial regimes. I think this book really demonstrates what Aimé Césaire and others have argued, that colonization dehumanizes the colonizer as well as the colonized. And this relationship looks a lot like the one formed between the Nazis and their victims as well. All of these aspects are what we're talking about when we're talking about colonization, imperialism, and a post-colonial world, not just the political status of a territory as a colony. And if you're thinking, yeah, okay, but didn't colonization end like 100 years ago? I just want to remind everyone that official colonial relationships only recently ended. Most African countries didn't gain independence until the late 60s, and some even later. And on top of that, commercial, political, and cultural relationships between colonial states and their former colonies have never stopped. The term for this more recent phenomenon is neocolonialism, and I suggest reading up about it if you're interested in how these phenomena persist until today. I think this illustrates what's at stake when we talk about the narratives of progress that are present in EU4. I'm not just nitpicking some historical inaccuracies or pushing some kind of agenda. I'm simply trying to show how the narratives adopted in EU4 fit with the imperialist political agenda of the West, and that those narratives have real consequences in the world today, including forming the basis of racism and justifying the continued exploitation and subjugation of people all over the world. I promised I'd come back to the idea of EU4's institutions representing the fundamental advances in civilization, according to the wiki. I have two paintings on screen that can illustrate how notions of progress, commerce, and civilizing efforts are inextricably linked in mainstream Western culture. I know I said I wouldn't show anything on screen, but you can just take my word for it if you're not watching. Just as the two paintings show the expansion of ideas, economic productivity, and cultural presence across land and sea, there's a sense in which institutions in EU4 represent the spread of these activities across the ever-globalizing world, with those ideas originating primarily in Europe. According to that Riemann's paradox video on institutions, if you're near Europe, you'll be fine. However, if you're not near Europe, you'll have trouble with the first three institutions that spawn. It's also not very rare for at least one of the four institutions to spawn outside of Europe, so it's not as though Europe really does completely dominate in terms of institution spawning, but those later ones are much easier to acquire, as Riemann describes in his video. Paradoxically, it seems to me that the justification for violence and exploitation, both during the height of the colonial period and today, is that Europe is bringing some kind of progress to the people she dominates. It's a paradox because we know all too well how horrible, and you might say barbaric, the practices of imperialist Western states have been, both in the past and in the present. Yet many in the West continue to believe that somehow the West did this for the good of the world, or for the good of the very people they were harming. This is obviously all over European colonial propaganda when it comes to the colonization of Africa and the continuation of those ties today. If you're American, think about how the horrors of the Vietnam War or the Iraq War or the Afghan War have been framed. In each case, the United States invaded a sovereign country, ostensibly for some kind of liberation of the peoples they were invading, either to save them from terrorism or from communism or from despotism. And yet we all know about the horrors committed by the United States in each of these invasions. What a sad paradox that the West tries to argue that it's saving the world by destroying entire countries. In the same way, in EU4, presumably when you would colonize a province, you raise its development somewhat. You increase its technology, you connect it to a global trade network, you expose it to new ideas. In other words, you bring what is called progress. But at what cost? To be honest, when I started writing this essay, I had some sense of what I was going to be criticizing in EU4. I knew there were some Eurocentric concepts in the gameplay, and I was excited to explore those and see what EU4 says about the world, since it touches on so many different historical and contemporary ideas like power, progress, economics, identity, but also colonization, industrialization, religious conflict, etc. But now that I'm about halfway through the gameplay topics I wanted to cover, I feel more than ever that the non-European content is literally just side content. Part of me sticks to the old EU4 player inside of me that says, no, that's ridiculous. Players love Japan, they love forming the Mughals, and the Aztecs, or playing around in India, or doing trade things in Southeast Asia. And of course, Songhai is a favorite, and forming Al-Andalus is great, and Ethiopia is cool, and trying to unify Islam is really fun. But as I've worked on this project, I'm really starting to realize that all this content is a minority when compared to the European content, both in mechanical complexity and especially narrative cohesion. I've had some people argue with me here on YouTube, and some of them do just say racist things, but I think most of them are genuinely just wondering why that's even a problem. They say, duh, of course it's Eurocentric, and that's what we want. And I guess I hadn't realized that as much before. I always saw the breadth and depth of EU4's content as a player, not from an analytical perspective, and since I honestly rarely played in Europe after my first few years with the game, I figured a lot of other people played outside of Europe too. I didn't realize that most people were primarily focused on European content and experiences, and to me that's really interesting. As for the emergent narratives that relate to the ideas of progress, I think EU4 is pretty clear-cut. On the whole, it prioritizes a linear advancement portrayal of technological adaptation that is in line with the dominant narratives of the West about how technologies are spread, despite academics and historians not always sharing that view in consensus. Something I'm noticing over and over is how the game is largely uncritical of any of the historical narratives it's depicting. It rarely challenges what might be called a traditional Western narrative of history and the other topics it represents, despite sometimes clearly having the hindsight to do so, like with colonization. At the same time, it pretends to be accurate despite artificially favoring Europe by building 90% of its mechanics and world simulation around European historical narratives. This fundamental contradiction is probably my biggest criticism of the game so far, and something I foresee myself returning to as I continue this analysis. If there's one thing I want to push back against in this section, it's the idea of temporal progress. Colonial narratives in the West have predisposed us to this schema of the world that things are constantly evolving in terms of progressing in complexity and superiority. We look around at our world and see the insane technological changes that occur literally every year, and we infer from that a reality that is short-sighted at best. The rapid growth in technological complexity and capacity that we see every day is factual, but to then infer that any other way of living is inferior is really stupid to me. Like, yes, our technologies absolutely give us certain advantages. For example, our global average life expectancy has basically doubled in the last 100 years. The world population has quintupled in the same amount of time. But what about other factors? Can we really objectively say that the way we live now is superior to other ways of living? For the people already typing in the comments, no, I wouldn't rather live in any other time than now. If anything, I'd personally probably want to live in the future. We're used to the world we live in, so of course it seems better for us, but I guarantee that almost everyone in the past would prefer their world to ours, despite some of the advantages we've gained. My point is, there's no such thing as civilizational advancement. There's not even such a thing as technological advancement unless we narrow our claim to a specific domain. For example, computer graphics have advanced in the last 20 years because today they have more photorealistic capability than they did 20 years ago, which is their goal. Without specific goals in mind, you can't ever compare two technologies. Yes, we live longer today, but I guarantee that we in the West are one of the most alienated and lonely civilizations ever. Yes, most of the world no longer has to farm to feed their family, but instead most have to work meaningless jobs in mass-produced corporatized industries. Worst of all to me is the notion of placing other people in the past through expressions of a less civilized status. Societies that differ from yours are not inferior, nor are they superior. You can compare certain aspects and make certain decisions about what you prioritize. I'm not arguing for moral equivalency, obviously, since I've spent hours on here criticizing past and present moral choices. But how can people not see that we're all human? I just want to thank everyone for watching this video. If you made it this far, that's crazy. I've been talking about EU4 for 2 hours now, over 2 parts, and I'm just really grateful that you're here. If you want to see more videos like this, you can subscribe and like the video. I'm also going to be opening up a Patreon with this video, so if you want to support the channel further, you can always do that. I'm honestly shocked that so many people have been interested in these videos so far. I also want to thank everyone who took the time to comment, even the negative comments. I know I made a few jokes in this video about them, but the vast majority of people have been extremely supportive, even when they're disagreeing. I really have appreciated some of the conversations I've had on here. And honestly, they've given me new ideas, so I do take the feedback I get very seriously. If you want to continue the discussion outside of YouTube comments, you can always join the Discord. There's a link in the description. Or you can hop on one of the streams I'll be doing to just kind of, answer any questions people have or, things like that. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.